Before the concept of a unified England existed on any map or in any royal decree, the British Isles were a fragmented mosaic of competing territories. Following the withdrawal of the Roman legions in the year 410, the administrative structure that had governed the province of Britannia for nearly 4 centuries collapsed. Into this vacuum migrated peoples from the continent, Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, who gradually established their own distinct realms across the landscape. By the 7th century, this political geography had coalesced into what historians later termed the Heptarchy. This structure consisted of 7 primary kingdoms: Northumbria in the north, dominating the lands from the Humber estuary to the Firth of Forth; Mercia in the Midlands, controlling the vast central plains; East Anglia in the fenlands of the east; and the southern Saxon kingdoms of Essex, Kent, Sussex, and Wessex. Life within these boundaries was defined by local custom and agricultural cycles, not by a central national identity. A man living in the settlement of Londonwick, modern London, in the year 700 would have identified himself as a Mercian or an East Saxon, depending on the shifting borders of the time, rather than as an Englishman. Governance was itinerant. The early kings did not rule from a fixed capital city. Instead, they traveled constantly with their royal household from one royal estate to another, consuming the food rents, known as the fjorm, owed to them by the local population. This constant movement was the only way to assert authority over the muddy tracts and dense forests that characterized the geography of the island. However, the catalyst for unification did not come from within. It arrived from the sea. In the late 8th century, specifically in the year 793, the monastery at Lindisfarne in Northumbria was sacked by Viking raiders. This event marked the beginning of a period of intense external pressure. By the year 865, a great heathen army had landed in East Anglia and systematically dismantled the northern and eastern kingdoms. Northumbria fell, East Anglia fell, the great kingdom of Mercia was partitioned. By the year 871, only the kingdom of Wessex, located in the southwest, south of the River Thames, remained independent. It was from the royal seat at Winchester that King Alfred, later known as the Great, orchestrated a defense that would evolve into a nation-building project. Alfred did not merely fight battles, he constructed an administrative grid. He reorganized the chaotic landscape of Wessex into a network of fortified market towns known as burhs. No village in Wessex was more than 20 miles, a day's march, from the safety of a burh. This was a triumph of logistics and centralized planning. To maintain these fortifications, Alfred instituted a complex tax system detailed in a document known as the Burghl Heidage, which listed 33 fortified places and the specific number of men required to defend each wall. In a similar spirit of preservation and structure, the archives of Hiddenoria are established to safeguard the quiet continuity of history. Just as Alfred sought to translate Latin texts into English so that wisdom would not be lost to the ravages of war, we curate these narratives to ensure they are not lost to the noise of the modern world. Your presence here and your subscription to this repository acts as a digital fortification, preserving the knowledge of the past for the future. The work begun by Alfred was continued by his son, Edward the Elder, and his grandson, Athelstan. These kings of Wessex systematically expanded their administrative control northwards, absorbing the remnants of Mercia and recapturing the Danelaw. The pivotal moment arrived in the year 927. On the 12th of July, at Emmet Bridge in Cumbria, King Athelstan received the submission of the kings of Scotland and Strathclyde. Coins minted in this period bear the Latin inscription Rex Totius Britanniae, King of all Britain. This was the first time such a claim could be made with political reality behind it. The governance of this newly unified realm required a new institution, the Witan, or the Witenagemot, meaning the meeting of wise men. This was not a democratic parliament, but a council of the kingdom's most powerful earls, thanes, and bishops. They gathered at places like Kingston upon Thames or Winchester to advise the king on laws, land grants, and foreign policy. Most crucially, the Witan held the power to elect the new king from among the eligible males of the royal house. The monarchy was not yet strictly primogeniture. The ability to lead warriors and administer justice was often valued over strict birth order. As the 10th century drew to a close, the machinery of the English state, with its shires, its reeves, and its unified coinage, was the most sophisticated in Europe. Yet this sophistication would soon be tested by a crisis of succession that would bring a new French-speaking aristocracy across the Channel to reshape the very earth of England. The administrative continuity of the Anglo-Saxon state was abruptly severed in the year 1066. On the 5th of January, King Edward the Confessor died in his palace at Westminster, leaving behind a newly consecrated abbey but no heir to the throne. The ensuing dispute was not merely a family quarrel but a geopolitical crisis that spanned northern Europe. The Witan, gathering in London, elected Harold Godwinson, the Earl of Wessex, as the king. However, across the English Channel, in the Duchy of Normandy, Duke William asserted that the throne had been promised to him years earlier. Simultaneously, in the north, the Norwegian king Harald Hardrada prepared an invasion fleet. The events of that year turned the island into a theater of logistical movement. Harold Godwinson marched his army north to Stamford Bridge in Yorkshire to defeat the Norwegians in late September, only to immediately march 250 miles south to face the Norman landing at Pevensey Bay in Sussex. The decisive engagement took place on the 14th of October 1066 on a ridge known as Senlac Hill near the modern town of Battle. The defeat of the English forces and the death of Harold Godwinson marked the total collapse of the indigenous aristocracy. When William was crowned in Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day of that year, the legal basis of land ownership in England was fundamentally rewritten. William the Conqueror operated under the concept that the entire kingdom was his personal property by right of conquest. He confiscated the vast estates of the English earls and redistributed them to his Norman followers. However, he did not grant them absolute ownership. Instead, he introduced a rigid feudal structure where land was held in fee from the king. A baron held land in exchange for providing a specific quota of mounted knights for the royal army. This transformed England into one of the most centralized monarchies in Europe, anchored by a network of new fortifications. In major settlements like London, York, and Lincoln, the Normans constructed motte and bailey castles, earthwork mounds topped with timber and later stone keeps, to serve as administrative hubs and symbols of occupation. By the year 1085, the military conquest was largely complete, but the fiscal situation was opaque. William needed to know the exact taxable value of his new kingdom. He was at Gloucester for the Christmas court of 1085 when he commissioned the Great Survey. This was an undertaking of unprecedented bureaucratic ambition. The king sent commissioners into every shire in England, dividing the country into 7 circuits. These officials held public inquiries in the local courts, demanding sworn testimony from the sheriff, the barons, the priests, and 6 villagers from every 100, a subdivision of a shire. The level of detail recorded was exhaustive and, to the local population, intrusive. The commissioners asked the name of the manor, who held it in the time of King Edward, who held it now, how many hides of land there were, how many plows were in the lordship, how many villagers, how many cottagers, how many slaves, how much woodland, how much meadow, how many mills, and how many fish ponds. They recorded the value of the land before 1066, its value when granted by William, and its current value. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a contemporary record, noted with a tone of resentment that not one ox nor one cow nor one pig was left out that was not set down in his record. The massive volume of data collected was compiled by royal scribes in the city of Winchester, the ancient capital. The result was 2 manuscript volumes, Little Domesday, covering Essex, Norfolk, and Suffolk, and Great Domesday, covering the rest of England south of the River Tees. The natives called it the Domesday Book, the Book of the Day of Judgment, because like the final judgment of God, its decisions were unalterable. There was no appeal against the record of the book. It was stored in the royal treasury at Winchester, often carried with the king's court in a chest reinforced with iron straps. This document solidified the feudal hierarchy. It revealed that by 1086, only about 5% of the land in England remained in the hands of English nobility. The rest was held by the king, the church, and roughly 200 Norman barons. When William died in the city of Rouen in 1087, he left behind a kingdom that was mapped, counted, and legally bound to the crown in a way that had no parallel in the medieval world. The foundation was laid, but the application of law within this structure remained personal and arbitrary. It would require the administrative genius of a new dynasty, arriving from the county of Anjou a century later, to transform these feudal customs into a standardized legal system that would eventually challenge the monarch himself. Following a period of civil strife known as the Anarchy, during which the administrative machinery of the realm had fractured, Henry II ascended to the throne in the year 1154. He was the first of the Plantagenet kings, ruling over a vast domain that stretched from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees in southern France. However, Henry was not merely a warrior, he was an administrative obsessive. He understood that the true power of the monarchy lay not just in the holding of land, but in the monopoly of justice. Prior to his reign, legal disputes were often settled in local manor courts or shire courts, where customs varied wildly from village to village. Henry sought to centralize this process, creating a unified system that would apply to all free men in the kingdom, the common law. The mechanism for this standardization was the general heir. The king appointed royal judges, men learned in the law, who traveled on specific circuits around the country. In the Assize of Clarendon in 1166, held at the Royal Hunting Lodge in Wiltshire, Henry established procedures for investigating crimes. He ordered that juries of 12 lawful men in every 100 and 4 men in every village must present on oath the names of any person suspected of robbery or murder. Furthermore, Henry expanded the use of the royal writ. If a subject felt wronged in a land dispute, they could purchase a standard writ from the royal chancery, a brief written command from the king, which ordered the local sheriff to bring the case before the royal justices. This bureaucratic innovation meant that English law began to be defined by written precedent and professional adjudication, rather than local superstition or trial by combat. The financial heart of this administration was the Exchequer, located at Westminster. It was named after the checkered cloth laid upon a table which functioned as an abacus for calculating the sheriff's accounts. Twice a year, at Easter and Michaelmas, the sheriffs were summoned to account for every penny of royal revenue. This rigorous auditing system ensured a steady flow of silver into the royal coffers, a necessity for the defense of the Angevin Empire. However, this efficient machine of state could be weaponized. Under Henry's son, King John, who succeeded his brother Richard I in 1199, the administration became an instrument of extortion. Following the catastrophic loss of the Duchy of Normandy to the French in 1204, John spent a decade squeezing England for the funds to reclaim his patrimony. He levied scutage, or shield money, at unprecedented rates. He imposed arbitrary fines for minor offenses and sold heiresses in marriage to the highest bidder. The barons, the primary victims of this fiscal aggression, finally renounced their allegiance in 1215. The resolution to this conflict took place on the 15th of June, 1215, in a water meadow beside the River Thames called Runnymede, located between the royal castle at Windsor and the rebel base at Staines. The document agreed upon there, known later as Magna Carta or the Great Charter, was not a declaration of human rights in the modern sense. It was a conservative, technical, and intensely detailed peace treaty designed to limit the king's ability to exploit feudal custom. Of the 63 clauses in the original charter, the vast majority dealt with specific administrative grievances. Clause 33 ordered the removal of all fish weirs from the Thames and Medway rivers to facilitate navigation. Clause 35 established standard measures for wine, ale, and corn, the London quarter, throughout the kingdom.
Clause 41 guaranteed the safety of foreign merchants to enter and leave England without evil tolls. While the famous clauses 39 and 40 promised that no free man would be imprisoned or stripped of his rights save by the lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the land, the immediate focus was on restraining the exchequer. Magna Carta was initially a failure. King John appealed to Pope Innocent III, who annulled the document weeks later, plunging the country into the First Barons' War. However, after John's death in October 1216 at Newark Castle, the charter was reissued by the regents of his young son, Henry III, in 1217 and again in 1225. With each reissue, it became less of a peace treaty and more of a foundational statute. It established a novel and enduring principle that the king was not above the law, but subject to it. This concept of limited monarchy would be tested repeatedly in the coming centuries, particularly as the loose Council of Barons evolved into a more formal legislative body capable of challenging the crown on a generational scale.
The stability of the later Plantagenet monarchy was ultimately undermined not by external conquest, but by biology. King Edward III, who died in June 1377, was a prolifically successful dynast. He left behind a surplus of male heirs, creating a complex web of cadet branches, the houses of Lancaster and York, that possessed vast landed wealth and royal blood in equal measure. The crisis began in earnest in the year 1399 at Westminster Hall. King Richard II, grandson of Edward III via his first son, was deposed by his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, the Duke of Lancaster, who was the son of Edward's third son, John of Gaunt. Henry took the throne as Henry IV. While this usurpation was politically successful, it created a permanent fracture in the legal line of succession. The House of Lancaster held the throne by parliamentary statute and force of arms, rather than by strict primogeniture. For over half a century, this fissure remained dormant, masked by the military successes of Henry V in France. However, under the long and administratively incompetent reign of Henry VI, the machinery of government began to fail. The breakdown of law and order in the shires allowed powerful magnates to recruit private armies of retainers, a practice known as livery and maintenance. By the 1450s, Richard, Duke of York, emerged as the primary challenger. His claim to the throne was genealogically superior to the king's, if one accepted succession through the female line. Richard was descended from Lionel of Antwerp, Edward III's second son, through his mother, whereas the Lancastrian king was descended from the third son. This was less a civil war and more a series of violent legal motions. In October 1460, Richard of York entered the Parliament chamber at Westminster and placed his hand upon the empty throne, formally asserting his right. The assembled lords, seeking a legal compromise to avoid further bloodshed, passed the Act of Accord on the 25th of October. This extraordinary statute allowed Henry VI to remain king for his lifetime, but disinherited his son in favor of Richard of York. It was a bureaucratic solution that satisfied no one. The subsequent battles, Wakefield in December 1460, where York was killed, and Towton in March 1461, where his son Edward crushed the Lancasters, were the physical enforcement of these competing legal interpretations. Edward IV, the first Yorkist king, attempted to restore administrative solvency. He utilized the chamber system of finance, bypassing the slow and cumbersome exchequer to manage revenues directly from his private apartments. Yet the dynastic instability persisted. Upon his sudden death in April 1483, the throne was seized by his brother, Richard III, after declaring Edward's children illegitimate. This renewed the dynastic legitimacy and opened the door for a claimant with one of the most tenuous genealogical links in English history. Henry Tudor, the Earl of Richmond, was living in exile in Brittany. His claim derived from his mother, Margaret Beaufort, a descendant of John of Gaunt through an illegitimate line that had been later legitimized but barred from the succession.
On the 22nd of August, 1485, Henry's forces met the royal army of Richard III near Market Bosworth in Leicestershire. The engagement was decided not merely by tactics, but by the defection of key nobles, the Stanley family, who shifted their allegiance mid-battle. Richard III was killed, the last English king to die in battle, and his circlet was reportedly found in a hawthorn bush. However, Henry Tudor, now king, Henry VII, understood that military victory alone did not constitute a stable government. He needed to surgically repair the genealogical wound opened in 1399. In January 1486, at Westminster Abbey, he married Elizabeth of York, the eldest daughter of Edward IV. This union combined the red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York into a single emblem, the Tudor rose. It was a masterpiece of political branding. Henry summoned Parliament not to elect him, but merely to recognize the fact of his accession. He dated his reign to the day before the Battle of Bosworth, legally transforming Richard III and his followers into traitors. With the dynastic dispute technically resolved, Henry turned his attention to the machinery of the state, initiating a period of bureaucratic centralization that would fundamentally alter the relationship between the crown, the church, and the bureaucracy.
When Henry VII died at Richmond Palace on the 21st of April, 1509, he bequeathed to his son a kingdom that was solvent and centralized. The machinery of the state, particularly the court of Star Chamber, had been effectively utilized to curb the excesses of the nobility. However, the reign of his son, Henry VIII, would see a transformation not just of enforcement, but of the very definition of sovereign power. This shift was driven by a single overriding administrative imperative, the securing of the succession. By the late 1520s, it became clear that Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon would produce no living male heir. In the context of the recent Wars of the Roses, this was a terrifying prospect for the stability of the realm. The resulting legal battle, known euphemistically as the King's Great Matter, was initially a diplomatic effort to secure an annulment from Pope Clement VII. When this failed due to the geopolitics of the Holy Roman Empire, Henry turned to a radical bureaucratic solution proposed by his chief minister, Thomas Cromwell. Cromwell, a lawyer and former merchant, envisioned a unitary state where the king held absolute jurisdiction over both temporal and spiritual bodies. This was not a religious reformation in the Lutheran sense, but a jurisdictional revolution. The Parliament of 1529, often called the Reformation Parliament, sat for 7 years and passed a deluge of legislation. The Act in Restraint of Appeals in 1533 forbade legal appeals to Rome, famously declaring that this realm of England is an empire, meaning a sovereign state with no superior legal authority on earth. This was followed by the Act of Supremacy in November 1534. This statute legally recognized Henry VIII as the supreme head of the Church of England. It was a nationalization of the Church's spiritual authority. To assess the material assets of this newly acquired Department of State, Cromwell commissioned the Valor Ecclesiasticus in 1535. Much like the Domesday Book 4.5 centuries earlier, this was a comprehensive audit of the income of every monastery, abbey, and priory in England and Wales. The data revealed immense wealth. Between 1536 and 1540, through a series of legal statutes known as the Dissolution of the Monasteries, the Crown seized the assets of over 800 religious houses. The lead was stripped from the roofs, the bells melted down for cannon, and the vast monastic estates were transferred to the Court of Augmentations, a new government department created specifically to manage this windfall. The long-term political consequence of this liquidation was profound. The Crown sold much of this land to the local gentry and nobility to fund foreign wars. This created a broad class of landowners who now had a vested financial interest in the preservation of the break with Rome. The administrative map of England was permanently redrawn. Following the
turbulent and short reigns of Edward VI, who pushed for radical Protestantism, and Mary I, who attempted a restoration of Catholicism, Elizabeth I ascended the throne in November 1558. Elizabeth was an administrator of supreme caution. Her primary legislative achievement, the Elizabethan Settlement of 1559, established a via media, or middle way. She adopted the title Supreme Governor rather than Supreme Head of the Church of England to appease reliable Catholics while retaining the Protestant prayer book. Under the guidance of her Secretary of State, William Cecil, Lord Burghley, the Privy Council evolved into a professional executive board. Meeting almost daily, this small group of ministers managed the details of the realm, from the price of grain to the movements of the Spanish Armada. The Tudor state became increasingly institutionalized. It was less dependent on the personal presence of the monarch and more reliant on the functioning of the council and the parliament. Yet, as Elizabeth aged without a husband or a child, the old biological anxiety returned. The continuity of the state once again depended on the legal interpretation of a bloodline, this time looking north towards the ancient kingdom of Scotland.
On the 24th of March, 1603, Queen Elizabeth I breathed her last at Richmond Palace. Within hours, a horseman named Sir Robert Carey was riding furiously north towards Edinburgh to inform King James VI of Scotland that he was now also King James I of England. This event, known as the Union of the Crowns, was a dynastic accident rather than a political integration. England and Scotland remained distinct sovereign states with separate parliaments, separate legal systems, and separate churches. They were united only by the physical person of the monarch. James traveled south, arriving in London in May, bringing with him a retinue of Scottish courtiers and a firm intellectual belief in the divine right of kings. James was a scholar king who had authored treatises such as The True Law of Free Monarchies, in which he argued that kings were appointed by God and were accountable to him alone, not to any earthly assembly. This theoretical stance immediately caused friction with the English Parliament. The English House of Commons had, over the preceding centuries, developed a constitutional custom wherein the monarch could not levy new taxes without their consent. The Stuarts viewed this as an irritating procedural hurdle. Parliament viewed it as the fundamental guarantee of liberty. The conflict intensified under James's son, Charles I, who ascended the throne in March 1625. Charles was an aesthetically sensitive but politically rigid man. His attempts to bypass Parliament to raise funds led to a constitutional standoff. In 1628, Parliament forced him to accept the Petition of Right, a document reaffirming that no man should be compelled to make any gift, loan, or tax without common consent by Act of Parliament. Charles accepted the petition, received his subsidies, and then promptly dissolved Parliament in 1629, resolving to rule without it. For the next 11 years, a period known as the Personal Rule, Charles relied on reviving archaic medieval fiscal mechanisms to fund his government. The most controversial of these was ship money. Historically, coastal counties provided ships for the Navy in times of war. Charles extended this levy to inland counties during peacetime, effectively turning it into a national tax without parliamentary approval. In 1637, a Buckinghamshire landowner named John Hampden refused to pay the 20 shillings assessed against him. Although the judges of the Exchequer found in the king's favor by a narrow margin, the legal argument exposed the fragility of royal authority. The administration collapsed not due to these taxes, but due to religious mismanagement in Scotland, which necessitated an army, which in turn necessitated money, which finally necessitated the recall of Parliament in 1640. The Long Parliament, as it became known, was in no mood to compromise. They passed acts ensuring they could not be dissolved without their own consent. The breakdown of trust was absolute. On the 4th of January, 1642, Charles I entered the House of Commons with armed guards to arrest 5 leading members, a breach of privilege that shattered the peace. The ensuing civil war was a bureaucratic nightmare as much as a military one. The country was partitioned into royalist and parliamentary zones, each establishing their own committees to collect taxes and confiscate property.
The eventual victory of Parliament's new model army led to an unprecedented legal event, the trial of the monarch. In January 1649, in Westminster Hall, Charles I was charged with treason against the people of England. He refused to enter a plea, arguing that no court had jurisdiction over a king. The court disagreed. On the 30th of January, Charles was beheaded on a scaffold outside the banqueting house in Whitehall. For the next 11 years, England was a republic styled as the Commonwealth. It was a period of intense constitutional experimentation under Oliver Cromwell. Various written constitutions, such as the Instrument of Government in 1653, were drafted to define the powers of the Lord Protector and the Council of State. However, the regime remained dependent on military force. Upon Cromwell's death and the failure of his son Richard, the political class realized that the traditional structure was the only guarantor of stability. In May 1660, Charles II was invited to return from exile. The monarchy was restored, but the fundamental question, where does ultimate sovereignty lie, with the king or with Parliament, remained dangerously unanswered, waiting for a final revolution to settle the account.
The restoration of Charles II had returned the king to Whitehall, but it had not resolved the religious tension that lay at the heart of the 17th century state. When Charles died on the 6th of February 1685, having converted to Catholicism on his deathbed, his brother James II ascended the throne. James was an open Catholic ruling a profoundly Protestant nation. For 3 years, the political class tolerated his attempts to suspend penal laws against Catholics, assuming that his reign would be a brief interlude before the crown passed to his Protestant daughter, Mary. However, on the 10th of June, 1688, the Queen gave birth to a son, James Francis Edward. This event fundamentally altered the actuarial calculations of the aristocracy. It promised a permanent Catholic dynasty. The response was a conspiracy of high treason. 7 leading political figures, known as the Immortal Seven, sent a ciphered letter to William of Orange, the stadtholder of the Dutch Republic and husband of James's daughter Mary, inviting him to intervene. William landed at Torbay in Devon on the 5th of November 1688 with a massive invasion force. It was a military operation, but the outcome was determined by a collapse of royal morale rather than a pitched battle. James II, abandoned by his generals and his daughters, fled to France in December. The legal problem facing the Convention Parliament that assembled in January 1689 was unprecedented. Was the throne vacant? Had James abdicated or been deposed? In a masterful piece of legal fiction, Parliament declared that James, by breaking the original contract between king and people and by fleeing the realm, had abdicated the government. They offered the throne jointly to William III and Mary II, but with strict conditions attached. These conditions were codified in the Bill of Rights of 1689. This was the death warrant of the divine right of kings. It stated explicitly that the suspension of laws by regal authority without the consent of Parliament was illegal. It prohibited the levying of money for the use of the crown without grant of Parliament. It guaranteed freedom of speech within parliamentary debates. From this point onward, the monarch ruled not by the grace of God alone, but by a statutory authority granted by Parliament. To ensure that the crown remained in Protestant hands, Parliament passed the Act of Settlement in 1701. This complex genealogical statute disqualified anyone who professed the popish religion or married a papist. It directed that should William and his successor, Anne, die without heirs, the throne would pass to the Electress Sophia of Hanover, a granddaughter of James I and her Protestant heirs. This act bypassed over 50 Catholic claimants with superior hereditary rights, proving that the law of Parliament was now superior to the law of blood. When Queen Anne died in Kensington Palace on the 1st of August, 1714, the crown passed in accordance with the act to Sophia's son, George, the Elector of Hanover. King George I arrived in Greenwich in September. He was a 54-year-old German prince who spoke limited English and had little interest in the intricate patronage networks of the British court. His ascension accelerated a crucial administrative evolution, the rise of the cabinet. Because the king ceased to attend the meetings of his ministers regularly, partly due to the language barrier and partly due to disinterest, the ministers began to meet privately to agree on policy before presenting it to the monarch for a rubber stamp.
This inner circle required a chairman. Sir Robert Walpole, who served as First Lord of the Treasury and Chancellor of the Exchequer from 1721 to 1742, effectively assumed this role. Walpole managed the House of Commons on behalf of the king, utilizing a vast system of patronage and bribery to ensure government majorities. Although the title Prime Minister was initially used as an insult to describe his overweening power, Walpole established the template for the modern office. He resided at number 10 Downing Street, a property offered to him by King George II, which Walpole accepted not for himself, but for the office of the First Lord of the Treasury in perpetuity. By the mid-18th century, the structure of the British government had fundamentally shifted. The king reigned and retained significant influence, but the business of the nation, taxes, laws, and administration, was conducted by a cabinet of ministers accountable to Parliament. The monarchy had survived by becoming a constitutional component of a larger bureaucratic machine.
In the early hours of the 20th of June, 1837, the 18-year-old Princess Victoria was woken at Kensington Palace to be told that her uncle, King William IV, had died. Her accession marked the beginning of a reign that would last for 63 years and 7 months, a period of time that allowed for a complete redefinition of the monarch's function within the state. When Victoria ascended the throne, the monarchy was unpopular and politically meddlesome. By the time of her death, it had become the revered symbolic center of a global empire. This transformation was not accidental. It was a necessary adaptation to the rise of mass democracy and the expansion of the franchise through the Reform Acts of 1832, 1867, and 1884. The early years of Victoria's reign saw the final flickers of direct royal interference in partisan politics. In 1839, during the bedchamber crisis, the Queen prevented the Tory leader Robert Peel from forming a government by refusing to dismiss her Whig ladies-in-waiting. It was a constitutional scandal, but it was an anomaly. Under the guidance of her husband, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, whom she married in 1840, the monarchy adopted a stance of strict political neutrality. Albert reorganized the royal household with the efficiency of a German bureaucrat, turning the court into a model of domestic respectability that aligned perfectly with the rising moral values of the middle class. While the monarch retreated from the cabinet room, the bureaucracy of the state expanded to manage a dominion on which the sun never set. The administration of the British Empire was conducted not from Buckingham Palace, but from the Colonial Office in Whitehall. Here, clerks and civil servants managed the affairs of Canada, India, Australia, and vast swaths of Africa. The Queen's role became legally abstract, but emotionally potent. In 1876, at the instigation of Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, Parliament passed the Royal Titles Act, proclaiming Victoria as Empress of India. This was a calculated move to bind the diverse populations of the subcontinent to the person of the sovereign, creating a direct feudal link that bypassed the sterile machinery of the Indian civil service. The theoretical framework for this new monarchy was codified by the journalist and constitutional scholar Walter Bagehot. In his seminal work, The English Constitution, published in 1867, Bagehot distinguished between the efficient parts of the Constitution, the Cabinet and the House of Commons, which did the work of governing, and the dignified parts, the monarchy and the House of Lords, which excited the reverence of the population. He famously summarized the monarch's remaining rights as the right to be consulted, the right to encourage, and the right to warn. The monarch had become the head of society rather than the head of government. This dignified role reached its zenith during the Diamond Jubilee of 1897. On the 22nd of June, a procession of 50,000 troops from every corner of the empire marched through London to St. Paul's Cathedral. The Queen, too frail to climb the steps, sat in her carriage at the bottom of the cathedral stairs for a brief service of thanksgiving. It was a spectacle of imperial unity centered on a small, elderly woman dressed in black silk. When Queen Victoria died at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight on the 22nd of January 1901, the institution appeared timeless and unshakable.
However, the new century would bring existential threats that no amount of ceremony could deflect. The dynasty, now officially the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, was German by blood and name. As the geopolitical tectonic plates shifted towards war with Germany, the very identity of the royal family would become a liability, necessitating one final, radical act of rebranding to ensure survival in a democratic age.
The death of Queen Victoria marked the end of the House of Hanover, and her son, Edward VII, inaugurated the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. This was technically accurate, as he took the name of his father's ducal house. However, less than 2 decades later, the geopolitical reality of the 20th century made this German nomenclature politically untenable. By 1917, the British Empire was deep into the First World War against the German Empire. The contrast between the British soldiers dying in the trenches of the Somme and the German surname of their king, George V, became a source of public unrest. The situation reached a breaking point in June 1917 when German Gotha heavy bombers carried out air raids on London, directly linking the family name to the instruments of death falling from the sky. On the 17th of July 1917, King George V issued a royal proclamation from Buckingham Palace. It was a decisive bureaucratic maneuver. The document declared that all the descendants in the male line of Queen Victoria, who are subjects of these realms, other than female descendants who marry or may have married, shall bear the name of Windsor. With a stroke of a pen, the historic German titles were relinquished, and the dynasty rebranded itself after the ancient castle in Berkshire that had served as a royal residence since the time of William the Conqueror. The House of Windsor was born not of blood, but of a press release. The new dynasty faced its gravest constitutional test not from war, but from the personal life of King George's son, Edward VIII. Upon the death of King George V on the 20th of January 1936, Edward ascended the throne. His desire to marry Wallis Simpson, an American socialite who had divorced twice, created an impossible legal conflict. The Church of England, of which the king was the supreme governor, did not allow for the remarriage of divorced persons while their former spouses were still living. The cabinet, led by Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, advised that the marriage was constitutionally impossible. The resolution was a dry legal document known as the Instrument of Abdication. On the 10th of December 1936, at Fort Belvedere in Windsor Great Park, Edward VIII signed the paper declaring his irrevocable determination to renounce the throne for myself and for my descendants. The following day, Parliament passed His Majesty's Declaration of Abdication Act 1936, giving the document legal force. It was the first voluntary abdication in the history of the monarchy, proving that the institution was now entirely subject to the will of Parliament. The new crown passed to Edward's younger brother, Albert, who took the regnal name George VI to emphasize continuity with his father. His reign, and that of his daughter Elizabeth II, who succeeded him on the 6th of February 1952, was characterized by a shift towards a welfare monarchy. The royal family became a visible component of the national service infrastructure. The coronation of Elizabeth II on the 2nd of June 1953 was the first to be fully televised. This broadcast brought the arcane rituals of the medieval state, the anointing, the investing with the spurs and orb, directly into the living rooms of the working class. Throughout the second half of the 20th century, the monarchy adapted to the loss of empire and the rise of the Commonwealth of Nations. The Statute of Westminster in 1931 had already established that the dominions were autonomous communities within the British Empire, equal in status. Thus, the monarch became not the ruler of a centralized empire, but the head of the Commonwealth, a free association of independent states. This required a grueling schedule of royal tours and diplomatic visits, transforming the monarch into the ultimate civil servant. By the time of the Platinum Jubilee in 2022, the institution had stripped itself of almost all executive power, retaining only the ceremonial and symbolic weight accumulated over a millennium. It stood as a silent witness to the passage of time, a living link to the Anglo-Saxon Witan preserved in the amber of protocol.
From the misty woodlands of the Heptarchy to the digital age of the 21st century, the narrative of the British monarchy is one of relentless survival. It is an institution that has weathered the Viking invasions, the Norman conquest, the dynastic bloodletting of the Wars of the Roses, the religious upheavals of the Reformation, the temporary abolition of the Civil War, and the constitutional restrictions of the Glorious Revolution. It has survived not by remaining rigid, but by engaging in a slow, almost imperceptible process of evolution. Like the physical structure of Windsor Castle, which has been expanded, rebuilt, and remodeled over 900 years, yet remains fundamentally the same fortress, the Crown adapts its facade while preserving its core foundation. The legal concept that underpins this survival is known as the King's Two Bodies. This medieval theory posits that the monarch has a body natural, which is mortal and subject to infirmity, aging, and death, and a body politic, which is invisible, intangible, and immortal. The body politic consists of the government, the laws, and the dignity of the state. When the natural body dies, the body politic migrates instantaneously to the heir. This is why, in English law, there is never a moment without a monarch. The instant the breath leaves the body of the sovereign, the successor is king or queen. The proclamation, "The king is dead, long live the king," is not a contradiction. It is a statement of legal continuity. The individual passes, but the crown endures. This continuity is physically enacted at the Accession Council, which meets at St. James's Palace in London, usually within 24 hours of a monarch's death. It is one of the oldest functioning aspects of the British Constitution. Privy councillors, great officers of state, and the Lord Mayor of London gather not to elect a new king, but to formally acknowledge the automatic succession that has already occurred by operation of law. It is a bureaucratic ritual of confirmation, a rubber stamp on the biological inevitable. The modern monarchy, as seen in the transition to King Charles III following the death of Elizabeth II in September 2022, functions as a living repository of the nation's history. Every year, during the state opening of Parliament, the monarch travels to the Palace of Westminster to read a speech written by the government of the day. Before entering the House of Commons, the official, known as Black Rod, has the door slammed in their face, symbolizing the independence of the Commons from the Crown, a ritual reenactment of the Civil War of 1642. These ceremonies are not empty theater, they are the fossilized remains of past political struggles, preserved in the amber of protocol. The archives of Hiddenoria serve a similar function. By documenting these minute details, the shifting borders, the statutes, and the genealogies, we ensure that the structure of the past remains visible. We are the custodians of the boring, the complex, and the enduring. History is often presented as a series of explosions and revolutions, but in reality, it is mostly a long, quiet river of administrative maintenance, inheritance laws, and the signing of documents in quiet rooms. As we conclude this survey of 1,000 years of regal succession, the noise of the present day fades away. The clerks of the Chancery put down their quills. The great oak doors of the muniment rooms are closed. The dust settles on the parchment rolls of the Domesday Book in the National Archives at Kew. The line of succession is secure, and the machinery of state continues its silent, rhythmic turning, indifferent to the passage of hours. There is a profound comfort in this stability. In a world of constant flux, the knowledge that some things, a title, a custom, a law, can persist for a millennium offers a sense of grounding. The king sits upon the throne, the Parliament sits at Westminster, the laws are enforced, and you, the observer of this long chronicle, can now rest. The history is safe. The record is complete. Let the weight of these centuries press down gently upon your eyelids. The archives are now closed.